So in the last session, we left it here where we talked on a very high level what it takes to deploy a Docker in ECS and what all other services are there and how we will configure them. So we did not talk in great detail. We did not went to AWS, but we talked about a high level conceptual level how these services are working in tandem with each other and how they all need to be configured in a right and proper manner to have your Docker running properly. So now let's look at this first layer, registry. So before I go to registry, I want to go quickly to my VS Code because here I want to make sure that I have a Docker file, my Docker is compiled and everything is working fine. And I must compile this Docker here, deploy it on my machine, test it, make sure everything is working before I go to AWS. Here, as you can see, this is a Docker file, which is plain vanilla, nothing special about it. Only important thing here, you have to keep a note that it is exposing the port 8080. So that's an important aspect of it. If you will not expose this port, your Docker will not work. Build is this Docker build and -t, and I give the name for my Docker. And it compiled very quickly because I already had it compiled and nothing changed. So it went pretty fast. So once you compile the Docker, you can go ahead and see that images and containers are showing up in the Docker desktop. So it's there now. Let's try to run it. This command is important because here I am saying that port 8080 is open and you should listen on the port 8080. And now I'll run the Docker. So once I run, I can go here and I can see this is running. This is the one which is running with port 8080. Now, if I don't run here with port 8080, you can do that from this UI. But if you will not, like this one, if you will just run it, it will run without the port binding and then things will not work. Now let's go ahead and quickly test this. So I'm typing localhost 8080 auth ping and I can see it's working. It's not secure because for HTTPS, I created my own certificates. So that's why it's not. But anyway, I'm sure about that our Docker is working, it's listening, the ping is working. Now let's go to AWS to the registry. Quick recall of this image. Now we are heading to the registry. And here in the registry, we have to create a repository. It's very simple. You click that, keep your repository private initially if you want, and you just give a name and leave everything default. We are going to keep most of the things default because we have to cover many services. If we start drilling down in every service, we will be lost because there's too many things to take care of. So in the first pass, what we will do, we'll take all the default and have all the services configured, and then later on we can come and drill down in each and every services. And I plan to make videos on each and every services, really have a deep dive into each one of them. So for now, let's keep it all default. Here we are keeping it default because we are saying the tag can be overwritten. But now let's leave it all default. This is anyway deprecated. And encryption setting, this is about if you want to encrypt your Docker image with your own keys, then you will use this. But let's say create repository. So once you create the repository, here you will see your repository and then you will see the Docker images which you have pushed. So initially, see, I was using the latest and I keep pushing the latest, and that's how it keeps changing the images. And now I have image tag. This is a scenario which we'll talk about later. But now, once your repository is created, look at the push commands. First of all, you have to have a proper authentication and authorization setup. You have to have your login, password, username, etc. from AWS. Use that to log in from the your VS Code. So if I go to my VS Code, I'll type that command, which is AWS ECR get login password, and you will see that its login succeeded. If you don't get this thing login succeeded, then you have to go download the AWS CLI and do a AWS configure. This one. This one will give you an option to update your key ID, access key, your default region name. Region name you have to keep an eye on. Miss this thing, you will be completely gone in a different region and you will be lost in AWS world. So those are the couple of things. Make sure it's all working. You are able to log in registry, and then next one is tagging your image. So here, this is the build command, which we already did. And then you tag your image with the latest, and then you push that image. So it's very simple. We will just go and quickly do this. Tag the image. Here I'm tagging this is my tag image. And then I will do my push. Here's I'm pushing the latest image into the registry. It will take a while, but we don't have to worry about it because I already have images. Now let's go and look at our next service. So after registry, we have to go and define the task definition in ECS. So let's go to ECS, and maybe we'll define a cluster there and then the task definition. So that's why I think this picture will help you. You will know what all need to be configured, and sometimes we jump up and down. So let's go to ECS. Here we are in ECS, click on the cluster. So let's go ahead and create a cluster. So click on create cluster. It give a cluster name, networking and subnet. This is very important, but for our scenario where we want to keep everything simple, just take the default, because when you're creating the cluster, AWS creates a VPC for you, and then it will give you a subnet. Keep it as is. Later on, when you understand everything, then you can start creating your VPNs, virtual private networks, and configuring all those things. So for now, let's leave it as is. In infrastructure, we already have AWS Fargate is selected. This is the best option for us because it is a serverless way to create your cluster. So we don't have to worry about anything. We have to just tell AWS, just give me a cluster so I can run my services, and that's it. But there are other two extra options are there. These are the advanced scenario where you want to manage the EC2 instances. You want to manually configure all those things. So we should talk about it later, but let's take the AWS Fargate. Monitoring I'm leaving as is, tag I'm leaving as is, but I want to emphasize one thing. This tag is very important in production, where you have multiple services, multiple products. So always pay attention to name your tag properly. This will help you. Now then just go ahead and create. Once you create, your cluster is created. And then inside the cluster, we can create the service. You can see the cluster has a service. So now we have the cluster. Now let's go first define the task definition, and then we'll come for the service. So we are heading towards AWS to create our task definition. So we are in ECS. Here you can see task definition. Now let's click on create new task definition. Here you will give your task definition family name. So here we are choosing again AWS Fargate launch type. So here you just go ahead and choose your operating system. Make sure you have tested your Docker with those operating system before you come and choose something here. And here is how many CPUs you want. There are multiple options and the memory options. All those things you can choose. And then the task role. So you may have multiple services and they are called by certain roles. So because this is a security feature on your services, that your services cannot be called by anybody else. They will be called only by certain roles. So that's where you will come and choose a role if you have defined. So I'm leaving it as is. And then there's a task execute, important because see what is the definition here. It's in task execution. IAM role is used by the container agent to make AWS API request on your behalf. The role used by the task to get your Docker image from the registry. So that's why you have to define a role which has permission to do certain things. This role has to have a permission to read your secret manager later on when you are dealing with it. So execution role is important. Just choose that. And if you don't have any execution role, then you have to go to IAM and create a role. And we can go and look at this role later on. Or why don't we just go and look at it right now? So give me a second. Let's create the duplicate tab. Type here IAM. And then here I have roles. And what was my role here was ECS task execution role. Task execution role. So if I'll click on this, I can see what are permission policies I have given to it. So it has it can read the secret manager, read, write. It has a full access to ECS. So all those role you have to make first before you come here and start using that execution role. And often you will find if there are issues, the issues will be of these execution roles not having a proper permission. So anyway, let's table that for a minute and continue on building our task definition. Here we are talking about container now finally. So here we have a repository URL. So if you go see in your repository, container registry, let's click on this latest. Here is the URI is there. So this URI I should be using to telling my task definition what container they need to pick it up. And as you can see, specify a name, container image, and whether it's marked as essential. And if I have multiple container, then this thing comes in picture, but now I have just one container. So I will just say it's an essential container. So this is important thing. You have to put the URI of your latest image. This is where you are binding the port. Remember when we build our Docker and we were testing it, we were binding with port 8080. So this is the time you will bind your port 8080. So container port 8080, protocol TCP, many CPUs, what is the memory limit. Add environment variable. This is again important thing. If you see in your Docker, you have an environment file where you are passing all the environments. So when you're deploying in ECS, you can define those environment variable here. So you don't have to check in your environment file in the Git because the environment can be taken from here. We will see later on when we turn this thing a auto deployment, a CI/CD pipeline, these environment variable can come from secret manager. But for now, if you have any important environment variables, define it here, give the values. Or you can add a file for that and then use log collection. This is important because if you will not define this, you will not see the logs in CloudWatch. And this is very important to do that. So for now, we'll keep it simple just with the CloudWatch. But as you can see, there are multiple options, but don't worry about that at this moment. Again, health check, you can define, you see here, you can define anything for your testing of your Docker. As I have a ping method, you can have different ping methods or things like that, which can be called to do the health check. I will leave all this container timeout, Docker configuration, all those things because we want to cover a lot of services. Storage, everything, all optional. Monitoring is optional at the point now, but in production, this should not be optional. You should monitor your CPU usage and everything else, have a trace collection and metric collection, etc. Tag, as I said, collection, it is very important. Now, once I click task definition, my task definition is defined here. Sorry, task definition. This is one of my task definition I have defined. You can see now I can create new version with a JSON. Now once I created it with UI, it's much easier to understand the JSON, look at the port mapping, all those things, and I can define how I'm going to pick up my secrets from the secret manager. But now, for now, you can just give something hard-coded. What is your region? What is your session key? And all those things. And then just say create. So this is where you can create the task definition. Now, coming back to our picture, we are at the blue line. We have created a task definition. And we have created a cluster also. Now let's go and create a service, okay? So we are here in cluster, click on the cluster, and then we are in the service tab here, and we can create a service. So we'll choose the default option, capacity provider strategy, use custom capacity provider, which is we are using the Fargate. There's a difference between Fargate and Fargate Spot. This is a AWS thing. They have on-demand, on-spot, a lot of different variations to get the resources. But let's stay with the default. And if you have multiple capacity provider, you can give them weightage and all that. Platform version latest. And what I'm doing is I'm defining a service here. And as you can see in the cluster, I can define a service or I can define a task. I want to define a service here because the service has some advanced characteristics. A service can say, I need always to have 3 tasks running. And if any of the tasks gets killed or not running, or there's a problem in the Docker, it will spawn another task. So that's the benefit of the service. So that's why let's choose service. Otherwise, you can just create a task also in that page, but stay with service. So we'll just choose the task definition here, which we have just created. So go ahead and choose this task, and revision will automatically select it for the latest. Give a service name. Is selected, which is saying this service will maintain a desired number of tasks across your cluster. So I said 1, you can say 3, again default. But here is few things we have to pay attention to. One is networking. This is again important. Remember when we created the cluster, it gave us the VPC and subnets. So just choose those default one, and later on we can play with these things. Use an existing security group. So this is again a security group. When you will stuck, things will not work, anything, you have to go back to the security group and look into it, that what rules are defined for these security groups, because these are the things which is going to bite you and things will not work. And keep public IP open so you can test the service by calling it from external. Now, load balancing is optional here. So this is what happens. You see, we are at the service level and we define the cluster, but now while defining the service, it's asking us, hey, where's the load balancer? But we have not defined the load balancer. So we can do that now. We can say application load balancer, because there are 3 kinds of load balancer and we want to use the simplest one. If you don't have already defined a load balancer, you can say here, create a new load balancer or use an existing load balancer. So I have existing load balancer, so I'm going to choose that. But let's take a pause here for a minute and go and look at how the load balancers are defined. So for that, you come to EC2, and then down here you will see load balancer. So I'm sorry to jump around, but that's why we created this picture, so which will make you understand how things are flowing. But for now, we were defining the service and suddenly the load balancer question came. So we were looking in how to create the load balancer. So here, as you can see, create load balancer. There are three ways, three kind of load balancers are there, and we'll choose the application. Network load balancer and gateway, they are little advanced. We'll talk about them later. But if you choose the application load balancer, then you can just choose, give a balancer name, keep it internet facing, and address type. It's a dual stack or IP4. But if your load balancer is sitting behind Route 53 or so, you can just use IP4 and you don't have to worry about other things. So keep the VPC as is default. Remember this VPC which has come when we were creating our cluster and all. So keep it default. Here we are talking about two availability zone, US West 1A, 1B, and just select them, keep them default. Security group here, keep them default. We will come back when we are trying to troubleshoot when things are not working, that what security group permissions are there on this security group. So remember that. Now, see, we are defining a listener. A listener is a process that checks for connection requests using the port and protocol you configure. So whatever things I will define here, if it's port 80, it's listening on the port 80, and then it will forward this call to one of the target groups. And the target group, we have not talked about the target group, but see here, I have not defined the target group so far. Now let's define the target group. Click here. So remember what happened? We were defining services, then we came to define load balancer, and then we went to listener, and then they said, okay, where's your target group? So we went jump to target group. So we are going little tangent from our main task. So create a target group. So this is a choose a target group. Let's keep it instance, and you can define different kind of target groups with IP address and lambda and all, and application load balancer. So keep it everything default, give a target group name. So protocol version, again, just leave it default. Health check. At root, you may have something with ping and all, which is returning some data. So leave health check as is, and then say next. And what happens is, let's look at the existing target group. So I already had a target group. So we are looking at this registered target. In the target group, we have registered a target, which is listening on port 8080. And this is the IP we gave of the target group. Where does this IP came from? 172.31.30 and 157. So if we will go to our Amazon ECS, you will find in ECS, I have a service, and then I have a task defined there. And this task has this IP address, 172.31.30.157. So that's what it is doing. It is saying this target group will forward this call to this IP. You see, this is my service and this is my task. So you may be wondering what's going on here, because we were defining service, then we jumped to we jumped to load balancer. From there, we went to listener and the task. So sometimes we have to leave things as is and then come back later on to it. So let's go here, the target group. We have defined the target group. And now let's go back defining our load balancer. So we were here, and I'm selecting my target group, which I created. And then You can add more listener if you have an add-on service. Let's leave this as is because this is an optional thing. Again, we will add some tags if needed. Otherwise, we'll leave everything and then create the load balancer. So once the load balancer is created, and using the load balancer, we went ahead and created a target groups also. So as you can see, I have a listener which is forwarding these things to these target groups. Okay. Now let's go back to services, which from where we came here and we left the halfway through. Okay, we are coming back because we were creating services and then we jumped to load balancer, and I think I lost my last session where we were creating the services. So that's okay. We can come back here and create the service, right? We talked about all this deployment service and choose a service, leave it this, give a service name, replica, leave this default, networking default. You can see it's a VPC and subnets, keep it default, load balancing. That's where we left off. So now this time, because I created the load balancer, so we can use the load balancer, use an existing load balancer here. Choose container to load balance to. So which container we want to load balance to. See, I already have this container and they will show up depending on your task definition which you have created, which you have chosen here on top. Task definition. Okay, so you will see if the load balancer is used, this create a new listener or use an existing listener. We created an existing listener while creating the listener and the target groups. Create a new target group. Now here, if you have not created the target group there, you could have created a new target group here and given some name. But as we have created the target group, we can choose one of those target groups. Okay. So as you can see, you have to name your target group and everything very clearly so you know what's going on, because very soon you will have multiple options for these target groups and cluster and services and all. So once you create all this and then you click create, order scaling, again we're leaving it all optional, but now you have created the service. So coming back, task definition is done, JSON of task is I showed you. Service we have created, cluster created, target groups and load balancer. And now the last one is Route 53, which will connect to load balancer. So let's go to Route 53 and you will have a hosted zone. And these hosted zones will be created by Route 53 when you are configuring your domain name where they should be coming to. So here you create one of the hosted zone. For API certified to win.com, I'm trying to create this. So my call come to Route 53 for APIs. And now I can click this and I will click this hosted zone and I'll say create a record, right? I'm creating a record and here I'm saying a simple routing I need to do. And then there are multiple things, but again, as I said, we'll drill deep into each services later on. So now we are trying to figure it out, how to route Route 53 to my DNS, to my load balancer. So define and simple record. Here, as you can see, this is certified to win.com and then route and then choose the endpoint. Here, you can choose the network load balancer. No, we want to choose the application load balancer. And if it is there, application and classic load balancer. Okay, so we choose this one. And here we have our region. We have to be sure that the region which we are choosing is the right one. So this is our region. Choose the load balancer and the load balancer name shows up here. And I click this, it will create a record in Route 53 to connect my load balancer with my Route 53. So as we seen, we connected to the load balancer. Load balancer, we already talked about listener, how listeners are connected with service and task definition and all that. So all this configuration will work if there is no issue with your security. So once you are done and you are trying to hit this API and the call is not going to the Docker, you should just check your security setting for each of the services. So I hope this will get you started. Now I will make multiple more videos drilling deep into each services. So let me know in the comment section how we can improve and what other information you need to have your Docker deployed into ECS. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your time.